Thank you, everyone. For those in the room, just a reminder that this introduction to the conference will be recorded for Radio National's Speaking Out program by one of our dear colleagues, Larissa Brent. So if you could please be silent, that would be appreciated by the sound recorders. Unfortunately, Auntie Glendra is delayed, so her acknowledgement will occur at the beginning of our first session, the conversation. So I will do a very brief introduction because the more important speakers follow me in relation to the conference. So in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of the Intangible Heritage Convention and the 20th anniversary of the Intangible Heritage Convention, the UNESCO Chair of International Law and Cultural Heritage with our partner universities at UTS, Renmin and Toulouse and Kent Law Schools are hosting a series of events on the theme of heritage and sustainability. This international conference is a unique opportunity to review and reflect on the formulation and operation of international, regional and national laws on cultural heritage and sustainability through the research of leading scholars from the Asia Pacific and Europe. So we are most grateful for the openings from our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andrew Parfitt, and the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Inclusion and Social Justice, Professor Very Firth. Professor Parfitt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome to everybody. Welcome to UTS, and for those of you online, also we hope you get a sense of the place here. Let me acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the owners of the land on which this campus stands. Pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge all the work that universities do collectively across Australia in advancing the progress of First Nations issues and addressing issues that need to be done to create the Australia that we want to see in the future. I would have acknowledged Auntie Glendra, were she here, but look forward to her acknowledgement later on. Also welcome to people online from China and France and North America and the UK. It's great to have an international community engaging with the issues. You'll hear a lot about First Nations issues, sustainable development, human rights. These are global issues. They're global issues. And as universities collectively, we have a role in supporting economic, social and cultural prosperity across all of our communities. So many of the issues that are addressed today are complex. They're complex issues. They need deep thinking, they need solutions, and they need engagement. Universities, while custodians of knowledge in all different ways, creators of new knowledge, translation of knowledge to people who are able to act on what we learn, the creation of communities of scholars and students who can then go out into practice to be able to progress the issues. Can't do this in isolation. We absolutely have to do this with the international collaborations, with national commitment, and with the deep focus of leaders. So today you'll hear from UNESCO Chair collaborators, you'll hear from our own Professor Larissa Brent and Professor Robin Quiggin, and their work in the area in particular in terms of protecting Indigenous cultural heritage, which of course is a necessary task that requires examination of language, scientific knowledge, agricultural knowledge, technical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and cultural and environmental issues. Across the First Nations issues in Indigenous higher education and research, UTS has a very strong commitment, as do many Australian universities, working together under a Universities Australia Indigenous higher education research and education strategy. So there are lots of things to do, and what a time to be able to be addressing these. We have examples of conflict, ideology clashes. We have many competing priorities that challenge cultural knowledges and actually threaten, in some cases, the advance of these. So work going on through here, through the centre, through the work of the chairs, will be able to make a real difference in some of these areas. Very important to this is the research student study and collaboration across institutions in PhD studies. In some senses, PhD students provide the glue that holds the research agenda together. So I was very pleased to learn that a collaboration amongst a number of universities to create a community of scholars in that area will also be able to make an impact as time goes forward. Very timely discussions, important to progress, and I look forward to hearing about the ideas and the discussions as you progress through the conference. Have a lovely conference and make sure that, in fact, these voices get heard through the work that you do.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Parfitt. Verity, I'll hand the floor to you. Our Pro Vice Chancellor for Social Justice and Inclusion, Professor Verity Firth.
Thank you very much, Anna, and I too am very excited to be here today for such an illustrious get-together on some of these critical global issues. I also want to acknowledge that today we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, that this land was never ceded. It was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm excited by collaborations such as this because, as everyone in this room and online knows, one of the things really identified in the SDGs is the need for partnership, the need for collaboration, the need for multi-sector partnership to really solve the world's wicked problems. And it's conferences like this, it's working through UNESCO and other multilateral government bodies or multilateral UN bodies that we're actually going to have a hope of solving these issues. Universities are also really good places to convene these sorts of conversations. As Andrew has said, although sometimes we're hampered by an evidence-based or expert model that can sometimes make us difficult collaborators, universities more and more are learning to listen and are learning that really great research comes from listening to lived experience, to listening to practitioner experience, and to actually, again, building the sorts of collaborations across sector that can bring to bear on the wicked problems that we face. So I think there's no better than the UTS Law School to be hosting this today. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion for doing this important work.
Thank you very, very much, Verity, of being very informal. It's a wonderful way to start our conference. It is unfortunate that she's also Professor Auntie Glenda is not here, but she will be coming shortly. And thank you very much to our VC and Pro Vice Chancellor for this wonderful welcome to and the commencement to the conference. Thank you.
There you go.
Hi, hello.
Hello, I think they're still haven't quite started yet.
I see, because I'm just thinking that there should be acknowledgement, the welcome and opening,
There will
and
be.
it should be all open, but I believe it hasn't been done so far.
I think that's right. I think
Because-
we're just
Ah,
it will be
okay.
unmuted. We will be able to hear when it gets started, is my understanding.
Yeah. I just saw briefly Anna in her gorgeous dress, but
Yes.
but that was all actually.
No, I think you're well
Yeah.
in time, and they'll kick off soon. They'll get started soon. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
The host.
It's just for the recording, so you won't hear it through the
Sustainable dress.
Welcome back, everybody, to our first panel, and which I've got to say, I'm deeply grateful for many people for this panel coming to realisation. First off, and I think it's fortuitous, I think the stars have aligned for Auntie Glendra to do the acknowledgement for country, or to country, to start off this session. Again, if people in the room could kindly be quiet, because it is being taped for the ABC Speaking Out program. Thank you, Auntie Glendra. I should also introduce Auntie, actually. Auntie, I apologise, I'm also speaking on the right. Auntie Glendra is our Aboriginal elder in residence at UTS. So we're so fortunate to have her. So thank you very much, Auntie Glendra Stubbs.
Oh, I'm very fortunate to be here. Yalamandu Marang Galindara. I'd like to thank Anna for inviting me here, and to my co-people, dear friends that I love dearly, sitting beside me to give me the strength that I need to get here on time and to conduct this really important acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank all our non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters that hold our hands and walk together with us on this journey of truth, healing and justice for all our people. So we couldn't do it without our non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters, because they hold our hands and pat us on the back and keep us grounded and know that we are completely loved. UTS is a very special place. I feel like the ancestors, I was going to say dumped me here, but that's not true. The ancestors allowed me to come here, and UTS does all that I believe in: social justice, diversity and inclusion. I also like to say that for our people, being part of the law system hasn't always been an easy journey. The legal people have been part of our, the people that have been able to assist with the removal of our children. So we've had to learn to trust, guys, the law people again. And I think, you know, that's really, really happening really a lot, because I see all these young social justice warrior lawyers that are here to make a difference for everyone in this country. So I feel really honoured and really blessed. That's probably enough from me, because I could talk for a long time.
Thank you so much, Auntie Glendra. We're so fortunate to have her, because she is the custodian as an elder of knowledge and wisdom, which we so deeply need in our universities these days. I will introduce our colleagues on the panel shortly, but I'd like to do an introduction to the panel. Our conference is on heritage and sustainability, but because we are in Australia and Sydney, I think it is important that we hear from our First Nations colleagues, friends, and as Auntie Glendra said, brothers and sisters. As I introduce the panel, I'd like to emphasise, and I think people from other parts of the world probably don't feel it as obviously, because sometimes it feels far away, but this idea of when other people speak about decolonisation, the colonial presence is still, and colonisation still occurs in Australia. We need to acknowledge that these are unceded lands, both physically, culturally and spiritually, and we'll be hearing about that during the panel today. And so the unsurrendered cultural property, both historical and present day, and we have colleagues here from other parts of the world where there are collecting institutions, which we know that their collections have important, both ancestral remains or ancestors in those collections, but also sacred materials or objects in those collections. So for many millennia indeed, there has been, and it continues to be, an Indigenous presence on our lands, and it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that we are here gathered today. When we're talking about colonisation, it's the idea of, and we know that it's a loaded word, but there have been government reports that have spoken about genocide or genocidal behaviour on these lands, or at the very least, discriminatory laws, policies and practices which need to be addressed. In some ways, or in many ways, we're still going backwards rather than going forwards. So the survival of cultural, linguistic and other kinds of heritage is extremely important for this struggle. It covers land, water, heritage rights, as well as the practice of culture, despite these difficulties. So it needs to be, and we know that this is now coming to the fore in international fora, but our Indigenous colleagues and advocates have said this for many decades, that it needs to be community driven so that the heritage can thrive and pass on to the next generation for those that are caring for land, water, species and communities and identity. And that knowledge, rather than being institutionally driven through heritage legislation and by those outside of the communities. It is also important that there be institutional support. This includes universities and an understanding so that the allies outside of Indigenous communities are able to assist them and indeed provide a space so that they are able to do their work going forward. So I'm very grateful to our colleagues. I know that they are all extremely busy, and hence why we've been rearranging the schedule in the last few hours. But I'm very grateful that they're able to join us for this panel. First off, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Professor Larissa, indeed distinguished Professor Larissa Behrendt, who is not with us here today. She is the head of Jumbunna Research and Learning here at UTS. She is an extraordinary person by any measure. She is fighting the good fight in Canberra for us, as she always does. I always say that there's probably many Larissas, and she is also the person that runs the program, Speaking Out. So we're very grateful to Larissa for ensuring that these important issues come to the fore in our conference today, including for those that are listening online. I'd like to now then introduce our colleagues that are on the panel. First off, Professor Robyn Quiggin, and there's many reasons why I'm sad, but that Robyn is not able to join us in person. She's on the coast, and more power to her, but she's not well, so she is isolating. But Professor Robyn Quiggin is the Interim Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Leadership and Engagement here at UTS. Robyn is a Wiradjuri lawyer who has worked on legal and policy issues of relevance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including the rights to culture, heritage and the arts and business, investment, finance, consumer issues, human rights and governance. Robyn is a trustee of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences Trust, Powerhouse Museum down the road from us, and Museum of Nyadza, and I apologise if I mispronounce that, Robyn, Dance College Board, and a member of the Insura IGA Consumer Advisory Board, a member of the Australian Securities and Investment Commission Consultative Panel, and a member of the Steering Committee of the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative. I know that Robyn actually has many more hats than that, but they're the ones that are of relevance to us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Jason DeSantelo. He's the Director of Indigenous Research at UTS School of Business here, and he's a Garawa and a Barangam man, and has worked in higher education for over 2 decades, combining legal education with creative methodologies to further Indigenous rights and environmental justice. Jason co-authored or co-edited Decolonising Research, Indigenous Story Work as Methodology, which was published in 2019. And his documentary, Water Shield, explores water contamination in his homelands in Buralua, please, my apologies, Jason, in Northern Territory. You can correct me. Our moderator for today is Kirsten Thorpe, a Worimi woman from Port Stephens. She's a senior researcher at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology UTS. Kirsten leads the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub, which advocates for Indigenous rights in archives and data and develops research and engagement in relation to refiguring libraries and archives to support the culturally appropriate ownership, management and ongoing preservation of Indigenous knowledges. Kirsten has broad interests in research and engagement with Indigenous protocols and decolonising practices in the library and archives field and the broader GLAM sector. Kirsten is an invited member of the International Council on Archives Expert Group on Indigenous Matters and a co-founder of the Indigenous Archives Collective. Before I welcome them formally, I would like to again express my thanks to each and every one of the panellists, reading through your bios, for that they have deeply informed my work. So I am deeply grateful for your leadership in this field. So panellists, I would like you to take the mics and Kirsten will moderate for you. Thank you very, very much, Kirsten.
Thanks, Anna, for the introductions, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really feel privileged to be here, and I want to thank Annie Blender for your acknowledgement of the country and for setting the scene for us in terms of being at UTS and having that sort of broad commitment to Indigenous excellence being explained. So Anna mentioned I'm going to be the moderator for the conversation today through this really important topic of talking about First Nations people, culture and sustainable development, and also contribute a few of my reflections along the way. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people and thank ancestors for their care and custodianship of the land for millennia. And also thank my colleagues, Robin and Jason, for being a part of the conversation. So Jason, I'm going to turn to you to set the scene. And I want to ask you the first sort of, it's a broad and probably complex question to answer in this sort of brief moment, but how would you describe the relationship between First Nations people and country?
Yeah, well, I firstly, yes, supporting us, and thank you, Anna, and greetings, everyone. It's a little bit awkward. We have to talk into a microphone this way. I want to acknowledge everyone. And thank you, Larissa, for a very complex question. But I think, for me, speaking as a guest on Gadigal country, I think, the relationship that we hold is always with respect to land. So I tread carefully on this land as a guest. And I would say, if there were 3 words that I would say that reflected probably my personal relationship to the land, it would be profound, fierce, and contested. In terms of the profound nature of our relationship, I think it transcends notions of time and space. It transcends the mundane. It speaks about spiritual dimensions to those connections that are so profound that it transcends words. It cannot be defined as ever changing and so vibrant in nature that it sparks shifts in whole landscapes. And those cultural landscapes, as Victor Stephenson has pointed out, the author of the landmark book Fire Country, we have evolved with the landscapes over thousands of years, using all of the different practices, theories and methodologies that have been created over thousands of years, like fire. In Australia, I guess, Kirsten, one of the things that we always think about is our ancestors' legacy. Over 80,000 years of being on these lands, and we look to our young people now at a time of immense, climate and social crisis. And I think the beauty and strength and resilience of these relationships will increasingly be a guiding light for the world. And, I think there's a whole lot of really amazing fashion, Indigenous fashion and stuff coming out. And one of my favorite t-shirts is "The future is Indigenous." And I really believe that. But yeah, just on that, I think, let me quote the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, State of the Environment Report 2021, which is co-authored by a highly respected colleague and friend, Dr. Terry Janke, a Wudhatha and Miriam woman, and an international authority on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. Indigenous Australians have a deep connection with the environment. They have lived on country for tens of thousands of years and have a cultural responsibility to care for country. The health of country and people are inextricably linked. Protected lands and seas have been shown to improve well-being through contact with nature, which benefits local communities, builds understandings of natural systems, and strengthens resilience to climate change. So in that regard, as we build an inventory of what to protect, we know this is a non-exhaustive list. We need to protect everything because it's all related. As we work together, how can we achieve this given the urgency of climate crisis? So I guess that's my little take on the relationship to country.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm going to turn to Robin now, joining us online. And Robin, I wanted to ask you, what important roles do cultural practice and regeneration, such as language? We know the amazing work that's happening in community contexts to revitalise language. What role do they play in First Nations communities? And on top of that, how do you believe they should be protected?
Thank you. Thanks, Kirsten. And thank you, Anna Glenda, for the lovely acknowledgement of country, and lovely to see you, Jason, and lovely to be here. Thank you, Anna, for the invitation to participate today. And thank you for all having me online. I'm a Wiradjuri person. I am a guest on Cammeraygal country at present. And I acknowledge the traditional owners and this country, this place that is still living, this country that is still alive, despite the built environment of our cities, country still lives. So I acknowledge that this place. It's a really important conversation that we're having. It's really lovely to just listen to Jason framing the conversation for us today in response to Larissa's question. The role of cultural practice and regeneration is fundamentally, it is about who we are. It's absolutely inherent to who we are, to practice culture, to speak our languages. And we do that in really diverse ways. I think I think I have to sort of preface this by letting those of you that are not from Australia perhaps understand the incredible diversity of the many clans, the many language groups, the many Aboriginal nations that we are across this huge continent, and across, as Jason was referencing Victor Stephenson's description, across the many cultural landscapes that are, that are part of this massive continent that we live on. So we do cultural practice and language practice in many different ways. In lots of places, language and culture are less disrupted. Cultural practices have been able to have a continuum, language, and many language speakers in places where there is that continuum are multiple language speakers. And for others of us, mostly on the East Coast, our language and our cultural practices are highly disrupted by the processes of colonisation. I'll reference the language, the way language is described by Wiradjuri elder Uncle Stan Grant is that language comes from country. So when we revitalise, thanks to him and his work with a colleague, when we are able to revitalise Wiradjuri language, we're speaking to country again. We are speaking the language of our place, the language that place has heard, that comes from that place and that place has heard for 60,000 years. So it's an extremely powerful medicine for country. It's a really powerful medicine for us, and it is part of our identity. It is reasserting our identity and being who we are. And the answer, I guess, to the question at a very general level too, is cultural practice and regeneration is who we are. It is always, it is the practice of who we are. It's very, very fundamental to us as people. And I want to just say that, you know, that's been really driven by Aboriginal and people and Torres Strait Islanders who have who know this, that it's fundamental to who we are, and have driven this practice and looked after this practice, because practice of language and culture was absolutely part of one of the ways we were punished in this very punitive process of colonization. People had their children taken for speaking language. People were sent to hundreds and hundreds of miles away to reserves and colonies, other parts of the colonies within the colonies as punishment for being who we are. So it has a very loaded history for us in the sense that it is who we are, and it was also has a long history of being a fundamental part of us that was used to really punish us. So there is great strength in this regeneration and revitalization work. And I wanted to say that we do it in lots of different ways too. We do it in the actual relearning of languages, as is happening now in Charles Sturt University, that runs a course. We do it amongst ourselves. We speak language to ourselves. And I think I was reflecting on some of our, you know, really prominent musicians at the moment, young musicians like Barker, who's a woman who does rap, but her name is the name of the river that she comes from. She's Barkindji, that is the river that she comes from. So her name, it's inherent in her name. And every time she performs, she's performing, you know, as that woman from that place. And beautiful violinist Eric Avery is absolute amazing prodigy violinist who sings in language as well. So, you know, from our old people to our old, you know, ways of doing things are moving forward and are in contemporary culture for us today. So they're powerful, they are who we are, and they are the ways that we quietly and noisily assert who we are in this colonized place. Thanks. Oh, the protection. Sorry, Kirsten. So we've got really good, at a level of principle, coming back to cultural material and cultural heritage material in the more sort of the way we think about it in a legal and more sort of classical sense. It is always about how do we set up rules for access, use, and in the commercial sense, which is often, you know, now how cultural material is often used in the art world, in the music world. How do we also ensure benefit sharing? So we have really amazing protocols at the moment, drawn up and developed by, as Jason was saying, Dr. Terry Janke and others who've worked with her, and the collecting institutions across the country have really worked together. Lots of Indigenous employees have really worked on in cultural and collecting institutions, have done an amazing job implementing those protocols. Driven really, it has come from Indigenous people pushing out into the collecting institutions, I would say. And then, as Anna Glenda was saying, you know, our allies work with us to make that part of the institutional framework. What we don't have, though, however, is any proper legal protections. Our legal framework is appalling in Australia. We are really have very, very poor legal protections. What we're developing is this practice through the implementation of protocols, and we have a long way to go. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. And I'd like to make a few comments thinking about the history of the management of Indigenous knowledges in those spaces across GLAM, when we're talking about galleries, libraries, archives and museums. And I guess picking up on what you're talking about, Robin, the real changes that are happening at the moment in terms of Indigenous reclamation. So, you know, from my perspective, our national and state libraries, our archives and museums are really seen as a place of reverence. They're a place for preserving our national culturally significant materials. But these institutions, as we're talking about the context of colonizations, haven't always served First Nations peoples well. So I always describe we've got really conflicting and contested relationships with these institutions. They're memory keeping places, but their work's modelled on colonial approaches to managing and preserving information. And so much of the work is based on extraction and the need to capture, to document and preserve rather than supporting communities in a living archive moment. That is providing care to material and governance of cultural material at a local level that sustains the things that we're talking about, the language revitalisation, the connections to country. We acknowledge always the preservation of stories in our elders, in our community, but also thinking about the dynamic nature that technologies play now. How do we interrelate them in a much more sophisticated way? So our archival legacies nationally and our processes around documenting First Nations people were also constructed without appropriate ethical constructs or informed by Indigenous people's ways of knowing or being. And there was a real lack of informed consent in that process. And on top of this, there was significant process of power in play. And so we see in our legacy collections that First Nations people are positioned as subjects of surveillance and objects of study. So essentially our record keeping practices of the past, and I'm sure that this plays into legal processes now, were really part of a tool of colonisation and dispossession. So although those collections have been formed about Aboriginal people, people haven't participated in decision-making processes on how to keep these materials and manage them through space and time. So I think right now, in hearing both Robin and Jason reflect on, cultural reclamation, revitalisation, and keeping that spirit of country alive, communities are calling for much more decision-making power and governance over this material. And as we've talked about, language revitalisation is a really good example, but I also know in my work that there are much broader conversations happening about decolonisation of museums, and people are really starting to contemplate how they'll do that work of turning the frame of that colonial work. So Robin, I want to go back to you again and ask, in your vast experience of working to support cultural heritage, how have you seen protection of First Nations culture and knowledge protected and change, and those changes over time? And do you think there are still remaining gaps in that work?
Thank you, Kirsten. That was really wonderful listening to you talking about our relationship with collecting institutions and the ways that the thinking about that is shifting, led by us really, and particularly, I want to acknowledge your own work in that space. It's wonderful to hear that. And so I think there's been a lot of work over the years. Let me preface this saying there's a lot. As I said before, there's a long way to go, and many of you who are here on the participating in the conference would know that the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, is doing work in relation to protocols and legislative change for the protections of Indigenous knowledges. It's I think together with the, UN processes are often very slow, and it is really good that they are doing that standard setting, at the international level, that kind of standard setting work, and thinking, bringing experts together over many, many years now to develop positions and international standards. The Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, the Nagoya Protocol for access and benefit sharing in relation to genetic resources. So really the kinds of knowledge that are around our medicine, our foods, and the ways that might contribute to commercial use around the world. That kind of work is really important, and the governance that surrounds that. And our colleague, Dr. Neva Collings, has recently completed her PhD on Indigenous governance for matters like the Nagoya, the operation, and when the Nagoya Protocol might be operationalized. I think about also some of the work of the Human Rights Committee in the Article 27, the ICCPR. I think there have been really good standard setting. There is good standard setting discourse, and of course, in relation to many other heritage treaties and conventions. So I think at the international level, there, the standard setting work and the discourse and the way we think about this and the way we talk about it at an international level has certainly moved along, and of course that is also expressed in Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we've made progress in how we think about these things, how we talk about these things, but how they actually start to land with any kinds of enforceable rights, we have a long way to go on that. I still again would just pay respect to the Indigenous staff and people like Kirsten and the people in our collecting institutions who've really and I for many years pressed these very discipline specific, quite, our museums, our collecting institutions, our GLAM sector, quite, old, discipline specific institutions that have, ways of doing things. And Indigenous people have just come in and pressed against those old ways of doing things. And I think we have a generation today of really quite amazing young people, well, they're young to me these days, working in those institutions, and they know they're standing on the shoulders of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that came before them, but they are just not taking no for an answer on stuff. They are just pressing out and getting Indigenous driven work in those institutions, self-determination, informed consent, as Kirsten was saying, and community driven work. It's a really, I think, dynamic, probably not moving fast enough for a lot of the people working in the institutions, but is a very dynamic space at the moment, led by this generation of Indigenous people working in the sector and the people who work with them. Some of it's driven, I think, by risk assessment. Nobody wants to be on the front page of the Herald, or our national papers for doing the wrong thing. And some of it is also driven by a growing understanding through engagement in those institutions and a desire to do well and to be innovators and to be at the front. The front of these things, particularly we've got some strong reparations programs going where, things are being given back to their rightful place. Part of it is also that among Indigenous people, we have really, people like Terry Janke and others have really, and the Australia Council for the Arts and others have really raised awareness out in the community about what our rights are. So we've become a much more informed group of knowledge holders and cultural heritage holders. So we are asking questions these days that we probably didn't think we didn't even know how to engage in the past, or how to ask those questions, or how to really frame those things. So there's a lot of awareness that's gone on in communities so that we're asking more questions. But there's still a long way to go. We don't have proper legal protections. Some of the ways that these things are being represented are in the private, they're clauses in the private agreements. So you might commission a work or commission having a private agreement contract, and there'll be a clause in there that speaks to Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. We don't have a whole lot of case history on any of that. Not a lot of that's been litigated, so they're in private agreements. What we need still is a proper national legislative framework, national and state and local, that we can really, that sets the standards, that says this is what is required, and something more enforceable than the protocols and the practice. That is a wonderful thing to see. But we still need the nation to put up its hand and say this matters, and it gets this. It has the status of national legal protection. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks, Robin. I was just thinking about the comments that Annie Glandra said about fierce warriors and thinking about all that work, both of people trying to reshape the legal structures, but work within the systems to find those places of agency and power to then turn that back to communities and find ways to navigate. And just thinking about that international and then national context, Jason, I want to turn to you to ask you the question of how do you think cultural heritage and knowledge is being regenerated? And how are communities caring for country, particularly in the face of pressures from the mining industry?
Thank you. And thanks, Robin. Robin, you really reminded me about how a lot of our elders and communities are really frustrated with the time that it's taking for this work to happen. And I think that the partnership model that universities are now engaging with in terms of our communities and knowledge holders is a key part of this. I think we have an important role to play in the revitalization of our culture and heritage, but also in the protection of it as it is being shared. You know, working with the late, highly revered elder, Uncle Max Dorman Harrison, who passed away quite recently. It was really nice to work with him in partnership with the university, to see him as a professor of the land, working with professors in an academic context. And he spoke at a forum that was very much like this in the design school. And at the end of his amazing talk, where he enthralled everyone, 80 something years old, someone asked, put their hand up, how can I learn all this knowledge, Uncle? How can I learn all this knowledge? You know, I really want to do all this kind of work. And he went, well, this took me 80,000 years. How long do you have? And I think, you know, that's the kind of time spans that we're working with. We're working in deep time. You know, we need to change, like Victor Stephenson has talked about, we need to change the landscapes. We need to put our own people back in the land. And that involves, you know, changing the way the legislative frameworks are creating management arrangements. And that speaks to the way we engage and create self-determination practices. But I did want to speak a little bit about, I guess, two things that I feel are making major changes in the national landscape. The first one is Fire Sticks, which is a national collective of cultural fire practitioners that Victor Stephenson and a number of other elders and practitioners have developed over quite a few years. And I think it's a profound and incredible amount of work that they've done in the face of extreme adversity, being blocked at every corner, to revitalize and bring back cultural fire into the landscape and to educate and bring people with them. So they're bringing organizations, they're working with farmers, we're working across the board in terms of land management to really change the way we understand our relationship to fire. Fire is a critical element of the Australian landscape, and that needs to be acknowledged. I think, you know, with the tragic wildfires that happened in 2019 and 2020 in the South Coast, there was a very, very important report that came out around sort of the impact of on what mental health and well-being from climate crisis. And it said in that report that 80% of Australians were impacted by those wildfires. 80% were impacted in some way or form. And I remember Victor and Arnie Rondo Grosvenor Dixon, a wonderful elder, and Nadina Dixon, talking at a rally straight, you know, not long after those fires, and there were specks of dust coming down. And Victor reminded us at that point that this is specks of animals and trees and all these things that we are inhaling. This is our country that's burning. So I really wanted to mention Fire Sticks, and the other one was the work of Original Power and the First Nations Clean Energy Network. Scotty, my nephew, I'm going to dob him in. He came back. He works for Original Power. He's from Borroloola up in the Northern Territory. He's a young man and a young leader, and he's been learning how to maintain and build solar kits and solar farms. We through the work of Original Power and the First Nations Clean Energy Network, Borroloola will be one of the first communities in Australia to build a completely community-owned solar array system that will be powering the township of Borroloola. So these kind of initiatives that are community-led, like Robin was talking about, that are deeply based in our own practices. The project that has been named in our language, Narara, which is the sun, it's the sun project. It's using the power of the sun to generate and overcome the energy crisis that we are in. You know, communities in the bush, they buy a $50 card from the supermarket and that gets used up in a day with air conditioning and the basic things that you need to do. This is not viable. It's been set up to fail. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those two things, Kirsten, as well. Yeah, I think I have a lot of hope for our young people, and I think just seeing some of our HDR students, some of our PhD and master's students here are doing incredible work. We have some of the Lucy Simpson, who is a ULOA designer and practitioner and scholar. She's doing an incredible project. Joel Spring, another Wiradjuri scholar, is doing incredible work in the spatial environment. The idea of decolonizing matters and understanding the built environment in new ways. And Ani Rhonda Grosvenor Dixon, who's doing an incredible work in the revitalization of Gadigal protocols and the idea of respectfully studying on country. So those are just a few things.
So wonderful, Robin and Jason, to hear your stories and hear the sharing about what I always think about moments of Indigenous excellence and how we constantly struggle against that deficit frame. And so I think sharing of these narratives also helps us to generate that new understanding that we're actually looking at systems and structures in a really different way and trying to find the moments, as you said, to empower community to have that sustainability and to honour and recognise country. In front of us, we've got these amazing native flowers, and just looking at the Banksias and, that stuff that we have to care for, we actually actively have to go out and protect that. I was thinking, Robin, as well, about the importance of protocols. And as you mentioned, they've been such a moment for people to navigate and have dialogue around these complex topics. And for me, I think the Indigenous data sovereignty movement is really going to be an enabler for change, for people to start to think about the reforms that we need in terms of that reclamation of knowledge and getting that back to community context, but also thinking about the transformations that need to take place so that we are actually managing material through space and time in ways that sits comfortably with communities' ways of knowing. And as you mentioned, Robert, in the beginning, there's such a diversity of communities, so we really need to be thinking about, how locally people inform, like you talked about, Ani Rhonda, designing those protocols in ways that make sense locally. So for me, I feel that we're in a real period of reclamation and reawakening, and there's real shifts that need to take place in terms of institutional constructs that can, make the changes that need to happen. And for me, in the spaces of museums, libraries, archives, and galleries, we need to start thinking about the handing over material in ways that hasn't happened before. And I think people get really uncomfortable with the idea of repatriation, and we're looking at it internationally, but I think we need to have much more of a focus nationally on how things get back to country and connect with people. And I think that constant kind of reshifting back to thinking about community wellbeing has to be the forefront of our mind. And again, in terms of the work that I'm thinking about, stopping those processes of documentation of cultural heritage that extract material from communities and take things to our national centres for preservation, rather than, actually investing in infrastructure to have things locally so people can call on them in the right way when it's needed. So, Robin, I want to ask you the final question in our discussion as we wrap up the conversation, and ask you how important are national benchmarks and protections in this work.
Thank you, Kirsten. I was just, I'll come to the question that I was really reflecting on what you were saying then and about, and in lots of conversations with Jason as well, about what an extractive society we live in. And I think it's been a, you know, the process of colonization has been a process of extracting our knowledge, extracting our children, extracting us from our land, extracting then the, you know, what are recognized, commercially recognized resources through mining from our country. So we have this really, we live in this context of incredible, where the economics and the social and the political dynamics have really been very extractive. And this is, I think, a lot of what we're talking about is really pushing back fire sticks, all the protocol work that and the returning of material to country. We're talking about a very different dynamic. We're talking about taking a deep breath in this country and saying, no more, no more. We need to do this differently. So I want to say that one of the ways, I'll come to the national benchmarking on heritage, but one of the ways that I am the most unlikely person to have ended up in following financial services. Honestly, I went to law school, and when they were talking about mortgages and insurance, I had my fingers in my ear saying, when will it stop? When will it stop? And strange, you know, life takes you in interesting paths. And where I've ended up, and the last thing that you know, that Anna read out about my bio was, you know, in this Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative. And one of the things that's really clear in terms of national benchmarking and a national approach is that we need to protect, we have such poor heritage protection laws for our country that we need to follow the money in this country. We need to follow the economics and follow the money. So in this growing discussion about sustainable finance, we are also inserting into that discourse now respect for Indigenous people by anybody financing projects on country. For those of you who are not from Australia, part of this was kicked off or brought unfortunately to the forefront by the blowing up by a major mining company, Rio Tinto, of a very important place in Western Australia known as Juukan Gorge. The traditional owners had said, no, do not, because we're often in positions where we're having to make awful choices about what happens on country because we don't have much bargaining power in these extractive, you know, literal mining extractive industries. But the local people had said, no, don't blow that place up. That's a really important place. And the miner did it anyway. So that risk assessment issue that I referred to was really enlivened for the company because it hit the front pages and it hit, and they were fined. Now, I mean, you know, corporations are fined all the time. I don't want to overstate what the fines meant, or, you know, I think, you know, people just, you know, it's really kind of like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic often. People turn up, you know, they lose one job, they're often, you know, reinstated in another one in that world. We know that. However, it did really raise the risk assessment issue, and it raised awareness, and Reconciliation Australia took action, and, you know, as much was done as was possible. So it's raised this question in the sustainable finance issue that's coming on, where people are thinking about where they're spending their money, where they're trying to encourage, you know, large financiers not to invest in things that are damaging in terms of climate. We are also inserting ourselves into that conversation and saying, while you're doing that, don't damage country either. Recognise the rights of free, prior and informed consent to the traditional owners of any country that you are doing any kind of development on. And that is that, but the place we're putting the pressure on and asking for that to happen is for the people who are financing it. So the investors, the superannuation funds, the banks, we're following, saying, look, we're going to follow the money again and set national standards for how investors deal and see the consequences and outcomes of the projects that they're investing in on Aboriginal land. So that's a really, I think, an interesting and innovative place that we are moving in as the beginning of the work to set national standards for that process in relation to financial services. To take a step back now and just think about national benchmarks for heritage protection in the more classic sense. Our National Heritage Protection Laws, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, is a draft act passed in 1984. It has had very little amendment. It's been reviewed a number of times, but it is nearly 40 years old. It was a draft at the time. It was an emergency sort of, it was an urgently, put together thing by Elizabeth Evatt at the time. She said it was a draft. This is our draft legislation. It was passed, and it stayed like that. It stayed as a very, very poor, in terms of the protection that it affords, very poor national protection for heritage in this country. We have a very, very low standard, and the national standard only kicks in when the state legislation is ineffective. Western Australia it's actually has redrafted its laws, but it's probably set the lowest standard in the country. So we've had very little access to proper protection for our land, the places of significance to us, to objects of significance on country. So, that has to change. We absolutely, and the government, this current government, I think, has made a commitment to that, and we hope that they will be held to that, and that we will get better protections for country and for heritage on physical heritage in that sense. We have no protection except for the limited amounts that the intellectual property regime, the copyright essentially, or the intellectual property regime provides for Indigenous knowledges. So there are people who, and I think some of our colleagues in the law faculty and others have been thinking about what proper Indigenous knowledge protection would look like in a legislative form at a national level. So there's been a lot of thinking done about that. So we're on the way, but we really need political support for this. And it's very easy for it to fall off the political agenda and because, as I say, we have this historical and present day dynamic of extraction in the economy, in the history, in the politics, social process are very much extractive. It is, is very much the country nationally, and businesses look at Indigenous people, look at Indigenous land and say, we'll have that, we'll have that, we'll have that, we'll have that. And we ask no one and we pay nothing for it. It has been really, I have to say, that's kind of been the dynamic that has been chipped away at. There is some progress that's been made in lots of different ways, but there's a long, long way to go. And we really, we need political will to implement proper protection for country and proper protections for our knowledge. People have done a lot with protocols. We've done a lot with what we've got, but we do need that legislative protection, and we need a government that's going to have the will to do it, to implement it, and to implement penalties for breaching. There needs to be some sort of something that matters to corporations and to governments. Something that matters to them needs to happen as a penalty for breaching protection. So setting up the standards, implementing the standards, and implementing that includes penalties for non-compliance. We've got a big job ahead of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. It's been such an incredible conversation, starting out with Arnie Glendra. And thank you for being here throughout the discussion today. Robin, you know, just weaving through that idea of reclamation, but then thinking about the impacts of colonisation and the ways that we, you know, find the sites for us to reinvest power to support communities has been fascinating. Jason, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you wanted to add finally before we hand back to Anna for reflections?
No, just wanted to say thank you, Arnie, and nice to see you, Robin, and really nice opportunity to be here with everyone.
So I'll hand back to you, Anna, and thanks, Robin, and thanks, Jason and Arnie Glendra again, and thanks for those that are here and online.
The only thing I'd like to say first is a thank you, and I'll come to that at the end, but just this, the only reflection is probably a wrap up of the deep thought and generosity, and that's one of the reasons I wanted this to be the first panel, is the generosity of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. And I know that there are people online listening that Robin knows, that a shout out to Dali in probably in Anchorage listening in online, who have fought the good fight for many, many decades. So the reflection, I think it's apt because of what has been said, is I was reading a report that was prepared by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2014, he prepared a report on climate change. And it's probably no surprise that First Nations people around the world are especially affected by amelioration efforts in relation to climate change. Yeah, so it's extractive industries, and now even the responses to climate change by governments around the world are especially adversely affecting First Nations peoples. So rather than end on a negative note, what he mentioned was, and emphasised a lot of what this panel was talking about, that is the positive contribution of First Nations peoples if we have the generosity of spirit and heart to listen to them as to the ways in which we can effectively respond to the challenges that we face globally, nationally and locally, because they've been doing it for millennia. But if we have the humility to listen, we will have effective responses, because they have been effective for many thousands of years. And for that reason, I'm very grateful to you, Auntie Glendra, Robin Quiggin, Jason DeSantala and Kirsten Thorpe, and I know she's here in spirit, Larissa Berendt. Thank you very, very much for this panel and for setting the tone for our conference. Thank you very, very much.
能听到，清楚的很。好的，好。Yes, yes, I can. Yes, clear. David, could you hear me? Yeah, we need another test. We have 2 interpreters. Please set Kong Sang as an interpreter. Thank you. 可以听到，谢谢。
actually, I haven't been a very good host. I think this is on mute. Is that right, David? Is this on mute now?
No, just on mute.
Please keep it on mute. Please mute just for a minute. Good host. I'm sorry for that because of the logistics of this morning's sessions. But please, if you need anything, just let us know. You know, hopefully by now that Australians we try to be hospitable. But just by way of logistics, the food will be around this area. But if you need to go to the amenities, so the toilets are just outside, and if you can't get back in, there should be somebody near reception that will let you back in. Yeah. So again. But we'll give you the logistics for other events and things later on during the course of the day. So formally welcome to you all. We're now going to start the formal proceedings in relation to with our Chinese colleagues because of the time difference. So now I'm very grateful to my colleague and the newly minted UTS to welcome everybody to this conference on heritage and sustainability that's been organised by the UNESCO Chair, but also the 4 universities of UTS, Renmin, Kent and Toulouse. First off, I will hand the floor over to Anita Schnucki to welcome everyone to these proceedings on behalf of the Law School.
Thank you very much, Anna. I would like to begin by acknowledging the fact that those of us who are here present in the room are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The UTS Faculty of Law and the City Campus sits upon these lands, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional owners of this land and also that this land was never ceded. I am delighted to be here today and to add my welcome to this fourth Universities Conference on the theme of heritage and sustainability, hosted by the UNESCO Chair, Anna, and UTS Law. As the Dean of this faculty, and as Anna mentioned, I'm a relatively new Dean. I take these sorts of gatherings extremely seriously, and it's heartwarming, I think, for all of us coming out of the last few years. I'm brave enough to say coming out of, that we can begin to reorganise, rejuvenate and look at how it is we run conferences in a hybrid / face-to-face mode. So it's very exciting to be here to open this particular conference and also to open the colloquium tomorrow. So I welcome all of you online and in person to this event. And for me, it's an amazing initiative. This consortium across the 4 universities and this partnership is really something that we all should be really proud of. I think it's a direction that most research initiatives should be thinking about in terms of moving towards. The times that we can do work alone and in silos, I think has far, far gone. And the idea of really being part of a global research community and a shared research agenda is just so exciting. And from that perspective, I really think that this is a trailblazing forging the way. And I know that you feel that you've probably been doing it for many, many years. But I think it's really a great model for all of us to think about. As you probably all know, this faculty is one where we have innovative research. We pride ourselves on the quality of our researchers, and we also are most excited about the impact we actually have, real world impact. And I think also we see that here in your collaborations and with the theme of this particular conference, which is integral to having the impact that I think the globe needs. So I'd like to acknowledge here all your work. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Anna as UNESCO Chair, and I know this has been a long time in the making for the other UNESCO chairs as well. Very grateful to have you here and that you've chosen, I guess, to have the conference at UTS. You're all very welcome, and we look forward to supporting you in the important work that you're undertaking in the restitution of cultural heritage. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Anita. So thank you very much. And now I'll move on to Mr. Pakresh. I don't know if you can hear us. Coming in from Canberra is probably the most difficult one to come in.
Hi there. Can hear you loud and clear.
He's talking, is he on mute?
Can you hear me?
Parakash?
Yeah.
We're just trying to organise the sound in the room for you.
Can you hear me now?
You may be on mute.
I don't think I'm on mute. No.
Be organised. But we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
So we might, Mr. Parakash, we can't hear you at the moment. So we might, my apologies, there seems to be some technical issues in the room. If you could hold on while we work out the technical issues, and we'll move on to your colleague from the Chinese National Commission for UNESCO, if that's possible. Ms. or Madame Su Ying, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese National Commission for UNESCO. Madame Su.
尊敬的悉尼科技大学法学院院长斯图姆克女
No,
士。
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
OK， 尊敬的澳大利亚联合国教科文组织全国委员会执行秘书长普拉卡什先生，尊敬的中国人民大学法学院党委书记、副院长杜焕芳教授，各位联合国教科文组织教习代表，各位专家，各位朋友，大家好！很高兴参加第2届4校文化遗产法论坛。我仅代表中国联合国教科文组织全国委员会，向本次论坛的举办表示热烈祝贺，向发起论坛的4所高校表示衷心感谢，向长期致力于文化遗产保护和法律研究的各位专家学者致以崇高的敬意。世界遗产是人类文明发展和自然演进的重要成果，也是促进不同文明交流互鉴的重要载体。保护好、传承好、利用好这些宝贵财富，是人类文明更续和世界可持续发展的必然要求，也是我们的共同责任。今年是保护世界文化和自然遗产公约通过50周年，明年我们也将迎来保护非物质文化遗产公约通过20周年。以这2个公约为代表，教科文组织在文化遗产领域形成了一系列国际公约以及相关合作机制，为保护世界文化遗产和文化多样性、促进可持续发展发挥了重要作用。中国政府高度重视文化遗产保护事业，加入并认真履行多项文化遗产公约，曾2次举办世界遗产大会，建立了以文物保护法和非物质文化遗产法为核心的文化遗产保护法律体系，依法加强遗产保护，促进科学研究，推动文化遗产保护利用成果惠及全体人民。中国高度重视遗产领域国际合作，深入参与遗产领域的国际法律秩序的建立，持续推动国内相关研究和合作项目发展。截至目前，中国已经设立了7个有关文化遗产的教科文组织教习，其中文化遗产法教习于2020年5月在中国人民大学设立，这是中国首个从法治视角关注文化遗产保护研究、人才培养、公众教育和国际交流的教习。自设立以来，克服疫情的影响，积极地开展富有成效的工作。希望本届4校文化遗产法论坛能够进一步加强文化遗产与可持续发展领域的国际交流，鼓励更多的人才，特别是青年人才投身文化遗产保护事业，推动构建更为公平、公正和可持续的文化遗产国际法律秩序。中国联合国教科文组织全国委员会将一如既往地发挥好协调和联络功能，为世界文化遗产事业和相关教科文组织教习建设发展做好支持服务工作，依托教科文组织的合作网络，进一步加强文化遗产领域的国际交流合作，为推动实现联合国2030可持续发展议程、构建人类命运共同体作出贡献。 最后，预祝本次论坛取得圆满成功，谢谢大家。
Thank you very much, Madam Xu Ying, the Deputy Secretary of the Chinese National Commission for UNESCO, for those opening remarks to our colleagues both here and around the world. We'd now like to hear from Professor Dun Hu Huang, the Vice Dean of Renmin Law School. Thank you, Professor Du. Professor Du, can you hear us?
Okay, thank you. 好，谢谢主持人安娜教授，尊敬的安娜塔院长、帕卡什秘书长、崔莹副秘书长、各位专家、各位来宾、女士们、先生们，大家上午好。今天由悉尼科技大学、联合国教科文组织、国际法文与文化遗产教习、中文大学联合国教科文组织文化遗产法教习、英国肯特大学、法国图鲁茨第一大学共同举办的第2届4校文化遗产法论坛，克服了疫情等种种困难和不便，如期和顺利的召开了。那么借助这个互联网平台，出席我们北京分论坛的中国专家能够与悉尼主会场的专家们在云端相见，线上相聚。在此，请允许我代表中国人民大学法学院将本次论坛的顺利召开表示热烈的祝贺，对各位专家学者积极参与论坛、支持论坛表示诚挚的感谢。中文大学法学院长期以来重视文化遗产法教学与研究工作。15年前，也就是2007年，设立了中国高校第1个文化遗产法研究所，在人才培养、教材建设、科学研究、公众宣传、国际交流等方面做出了卓越贡献。刚才崔莹副秘书长也提到，2020年5月，联合国教科文组织正式批准在中国人民大学设立文化遗产法教系，由我国文化遗产法专家王英霞教授担任教系主持人。这个教系的设立大大加强了法学院文化遗产法学科的研究与发展，从而提升了我们法学院文化遗产法学科的国际影响力。那么为了加强文化遗产法研究和教学领域的国际交流，我们法学院自2011年起，基于法国奥夫涅大学法学院共同发起了中法文化遗产法研讨会系列学术活动，并成功举办了6届研讨会。那么在巩固中法2校既有合作的基础上，中国人民大学法学院联合法国杜鲁茨第一大学、澳大利亚悉尼科技大学和英国肯特大学，进一步扩大了文化遗产法领域的国际交流与合作。那么4校在中法文化遗产法研讨会的基础上，共同发起了4校文化遗产法论坛，也是一个4校的约定分别在4国轮流举办文化遗产法的国际学术会议。那么第1届会议，也就是2019年文化遗产法前沿问题国际学术研讨会很荣幸由中国大学法学院承办，成功召开，应当说为我们4校文化遗产法的学科国际合作奠定了良好基础。今天我们这个很欣喜的看到第2届4校文化遗产法论坛在期待中如期开幕，采用这个线上与线下相结合的会议方式。我也高兴的看到参加今天论坛的嘉宾中有不少这个我们许多熟悉的老面孔，也有很多我们的这个新朋友。但是受疫情的影响呢，我们中国的参会嘉宾 只能在线上与大家相聚，但我想这并不能够阻挡大家对于文化遗产法研讨的高涨的热情。那么刚才车莹秘书长讲到啊，在保护世界文化遗产自然遗产公约那么颁布50周年之际，保护文化、保护自然遗产对于人类的社会可持续的发展的重要意义，已经成为了国际共识。那其中也涉及到很多法律的问题、道德的问题，也需要随着我们这个后疫情时代的发展啊，需要给出一个全新的答案。我也衷心希望我们各位参会嘉宾各抒己见，畅所欲言，共同来促进四小文化遗产法学科的发展与进步。衷心希望大家继续支持四小文化遗产法论坛活动和我们人大法学院文化遗产法学科的建设与发展，也非常欢迎大家在疫情平稳之后啊，到访人大法学院。最后呢，我想预祝本届研讨会取得圆满成功，祝各位专家身体健康，万事如意。谢谢各位。
Thank you very, very much, Professor Du. Again, from the Vice Dean from Remin Law School, we are very, very grateful to you and for your wonderful welcoming opening words. And we will certainly be taking you up on your offer again when we are all able to enjoy the hospitality of your law school and also Beijing. I know we've all been the beneficiaries of that. As I said to my colleagues when we were planning these over the last few years, that I'm very sad that we have not been able to return the hospitality that you so generously afforded us in 2019 and indeed in previous years. And we wish you all the very best that you are able to control the pandemic in your country. And we are very grateful for your participation. Now we will try again to connect with Canberra and Mr. Dick Kwan Parakash.
Can you hear me now?
Wonderful. He is the acting chair of the UNESCO National Commission, the Australian National Commission. Thank you very much, Mr. Parakash. He's standing in the place of Ms. Claire McNamara, who is ill and is unfortunately not able to join us. But Mr. Parakash, the floor is yours in beautiful tropical Canberra.
Thanks very much. I thought I'd change.
We still can't. I don't know what it is. Maybe if you don't use the ear pods.
Can you hear me now?
No. We can't. No. Mr. Parakash? Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Oh my God. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you. Oh,
All right,
wonderful.
I'll crack on.
Excellent. Wonderful. Welcome. Wish you were here at UTS in Sydney.
Look, thanks very much for the invitation. I have to say, as a former international lawyer working on cultural heritage issues in a previous life, it gives me great pleasure to be able to join you today on behalf of Claire, Chair of the Australian National Commission for UNESCO. I have to say the multilateral system is obviously never been under as immense pressure as it has today. We see the impact of efforts to find global solutions to global challenges. And the cultural heritage space really is a shining example of that. The rules-based order, the rules, norms and standards that many of our institutions and the multilateral system more broadly is based on is under threat. And it's groups like these and meetings like these that really bring all of that together in a positive frame. So my team has given me a couple of words on the UNESCO Chair Program that I'll share with you, given the presentation is on behalf of the Australian National Commission for UNESCO. It's the 30th anniversary was celebrated recently in Paris, and the objective of the program is to promote international inter-university knowledge sharing, and creating a unique pool of intellectual and scientific cooperation at all levels. And this conference, as I mentioned, is a clear example of the program's success. Australia really values UNESCO's global leadership on the protection of cultural heritage and cultural diversity. We acknowledge the importance of global exchange on cultural property, and have formed long-standing relationships with international organisations, including UNESCO, Interpol, and among others, to monitor and to tackle the illicit trade in cultural material. Our government prioritises the protection of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, in particular in the context of First Nations. A primary focus for Australia is the promotion and protection of First Nations languages and cultural expressions through programs such as the Indigenous Language and Arts Program, the Indigenous Visual Arts Industry Support Program. And we also acknowledge the potential of World Heritage properties and heritage in general to contribute to sustainable development. Australia is committed to working with First Nations people to add Indigenous cultural values to a number of existing World Heritage properties, which gives due recognition to the significance of First Nations cultural values within the landscape and expertise of First Nations people. So given the technical difficulties, I'll keep my remarks short because I imagine that you'd like to crack on with the rest of the conference. And just to say that very much value the work and the thought that has been put into this program, and wish you and the delegates a very successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parakash. And I'd also like to thank the other people that have welcomed on the participants to this conference, Professor Stumke, Madam Xu Ning, and Professor Du at Renmin University. Thank you very, very much for your time, and despite the technical difficulties, including the very strange closed captioning, which we will try and rectify. Thank you, and I'm sure that the participants have greatly appreciated that. We look forward to working with colleagues both here and afar. So thank you very, very much for that welcome. We'll suspend the audio for so that we can set up for the next panel, session 2, and we'll try and rectify the issues around the closed captioning if we can in that time. So thank you for your patience. You can.
Okay. So we're going on and entering the topic. The main topic of the conference was a plenary session on cultural heritage and sustainable development, which is the main issue of this conference. This is a very important and new question which has been raised by international negotiations and which Anna Filipa Tolczak just suggested us for this conference from the beginning, and I'm very glad to see that because I see here very many new ways of thinking and developments for international law and also for our cooperation, because we're here for the first, saying before, the first conference from COVID time of this new network. And it is important for us to address, I think, global issues as we're a global network. So in this plenary session about cultural heritage and sustainable development, we will try to cover the first and key principles and actors which may be engaged in cultural heritage protection and policy, be it tangible or intangible heritage, and see whether and how this can be combined with sustainability and sustainable development discourses. To address these questions, we have very brilliant and different panelists. First and foremost, we will begin with Anna Filipa Tolczak, who is the main host of this conference, the UNESCO chair in international law in cultural heritage. She's professor here in the Faculty of Law of the University of Technology, Sydney. She has many other, obviously, other things that we should be say regarding the curriculum. We will then have also the intervention of Pascal Beauvais, who is coming from Paris Sorbonne University, who has been, is currently the director of the Institute of Judicial Studies at Sorbonne University and is a member of French National Council of University, is a criminal lawyer with, as we have few in France, specialized in European and international criminal law. So it will address the topic from this perspective. And he has been writing already a lot of reports and papers on the issue of cultural heritage and cultural properties. After that, we will listen to another member of the network, important key feature of the network, Sophie Vigneron, who is a reader at in the other university of the network, Kent Law School, and she's currently the co-director of the Center for Heritage. She's also involved in many international activities because she's been from the beginning specialized in both French and English law, and she also addresses American law and international law. And as a matter of fact, she's member of the UNIDRA academic project for the moment, and also of ISHA, which is the International Society for Research on Art and Cultural Heritage. And last but not least, we have an intervention also from Renmin University of China from a different perspective, because this is a perspective from history, from Chaiko Queen Wang, who will be addressing the question of China's archaeological excavation and cultural heritage protection in the context of sustainable development. So I don't want to be the only one talking, and we'll be listening to Anna Filipa Tolczak, which we will be presenting maybe an historical and the historical perspective and the narrative, I would say, of the main issue today.
Thank you, Clementine. That was the plan, but because of the time, and I should warn the translators that it will be just the beginning and end of my paper. So my apologies to all, but I would rather cede time to what we've already heard. I think because part of what we will be discussing today is to give back to the people that have created and cared for heritage their voice, and so I'm absolutely happy to cede time to that. The plan was for my intervention to provide context, and so what I will do is just give a brief introduction and then explain, as I've found these developments to have impacted on international cultural heritage law. So let me begin. Culture and cultural heritage have been central to our evolving understanding of the normative context of development in international law since the foundation of the United Nations. For non-aligned countries, championing the right to development as fundamental to decolonisation and independence, cultural heritage was a driving preoccupation to achieving equality between states. For civil society, since the 1970s, there has been demands for a more holistic understanding of development by the international community, encompassing economic, social, environmental, sustainable development, an appreciation of the role of culture as an enabler and driver. Yet despite repeated efforts to facilitate a better understanding of and appreciation of the role of culture and cultural heritage in sustainable development by states and in the general public, much work remains to be done, as we will hear. The principle of sustainable development, however, is becoming a central pillar of international cultural heritage law. Since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, by the General Assembly in 2015 and their implementation by UN bodies and agencies, including the Specialist Cultural Organisation UNESCO, sustainable development is informing the interpretation and implementation of each of its culture conventions. This process is having a gradual but potentially transformative impact on international cultural heritage law by reinforcing the essential role of culture and cultural heritage in the effective enjoyment of human rights and the maintenance of peace and security, a role which was assigned to UNESCO in its foundational document. So, and by way of an overview, rather than providing what was the intention of going through and tracking through how this has evolved over time within the UN system, what I would like to emphasise before I go to my conclusion very quickly is that at each step of the way, from the right to development during decolonisation, from the MDGs to the SDGs, there has been a push to try and include culture at every step of the way, and that we know that that has been difficult because of other priorities of other parts of the UN system and also actors within nation states. But what is clear is, and that's why it was wonderful that we started with our Indigenous colleagues this morning, is that often if there has been leeway or headway made, it is because of their efforts. In a lot of these international fora, is they're pushing the emphasis of, probably the most effective ways of pushing the emphasis on why culture is important in that very broad sense. So it's not just material culture, whether it's monuments and sites or objects within museums or even libraries and archives. It is that idea of a living culture, and that feeds into the resilience of people. And so I would really like to emphasise, because I'm not able to do it by going through my paper, the importance of the intervention of our Indigenous colleagues, both at the international level, the local level, and also the national levels. So let me, and it's quite odd that I'm drawing conclusions when I haven't given you the background, but I will, because I know that a lot of those listening in probably already know some of the background that I would have otherwise given you, is that the adoption of the SDGs and their implementation by UNESCO in its policies and programs is having a gradual and potentially transformative impact on its culture conventions and by extension, international cultural heritage law more generally. There is, I believe, three discernible aspects to this. First, there is renewed efforts to integrate the operation of the conventions so that rather than there being siloed, the reinforcement of the importance of the role of culture and cultural heritage for human rights and peace and security, and the application of the principles of sustainable development in the field of cultural heritage law. Now, and I'll go through each one of those remarks. Much has been made, rightly, of the siloing of the international protection of cultural heritage by the culture conventions. Not only is each treaty equal and independent of each other under the law of treaties, each instrument is reflective of the preoccupation and the drivers of their states' parties and the milieu in which they were drafted and adopted. However, there is a growing understanding of the holistic nature of cultural heritage, which is not properly reflected in the operation of each of the treaties in isolation. Although there have been efforts to foster the integration of these treaties, the operation of them due to the increasingly limited resources of UNESCO. This effort has gained greater impetus with the implementation of the SDGs. The push for integration has fostered meetings between the governing bodies, including the secretariats, sharing of experiences and good practice, and efforts towards harmonisation of work across the conventions, including respect of matters touching upon the SDGs. This movement towards integration, as limited as it may be, can facilitate a more coherent consolidation of international cultural heritage law and practice generally. In this sense, the SDGs may be having a tacit, though more limited, effect on UNESCO's cultural conventions, similar to that which the Framework Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society, the Faro Convention, is intended to have on the Council of Europe's culture treaties. Another impact of the UN 2030 agenda on our understanding of the culture conventions is the manner through which most, if not all, of them have been aligned with the SDGs in relation to the rule of law and peace. So it's that particular SDG. Not only there has been near consistency across the conventions in relation to this, as furthered integration efforts, but it also brings the treaties back to UNESCO's constitution and the organisation's stated purpose, and the objective for which the treaties and the cultural heritage were adopted by the organisation. That is, to contribute to peace and security by promoting collaboration across the nations through the culture in order to further universal respect for justice, the rule of law, and for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Rather than that being the raison d'etre of these conventions, this objective may often be lost in their implementation. Therefore, in a circuitous fashion, the SDGs have the potential to reinforce the core rationale for these treaties. The third element is the application of the principle of sustainable development in the field of cultural heritage protection. As noted earlier, the principle has been recognised and applied by the International Court of Justice, sorry, I would have indicated that to you earlier, and other international tribunals, and forms part of customary international law since the end of the last century. Although developed in respect of natural resources and the natural environment, the principle is increasingly being recognised as applicable to cultural heritage. However, while the underlying content and the elements of the principle are similar, they are tailored to the specific concerns of culture and respective development. And in so doing, they actually address the 5 Ps, the SDGs, that is people, planet, prosperity and peace and partnership. Therefore, the core concern of the Cultural Heritage Conventions is the promotion and protection of cultural diversity for the benefit of humanity. This has been indicated explicitly and implicitly in all the UNESCO treaties on culture since the 1954 Convention, but perhaps in its fullest extent in the 2001 Universal Declaration, the latter arguably being considered a framework instrument for our interpretation of the Culture Conventions. The principle of sustainable development, as it applies to cultural diversity and cultural heritage, has a number of identifiable elements. First, intergenerational equity and the safeguarding and promotion of cultural diversity and cultural heritage as a cultural heritage of humanity is for the benefit of future generations is most clearly manifest in the World Heritage Convention. The rationale as the cultural heritage of humanity underscores the need for international cooperation through multilateral instruments. Second, sustainable use and the notion of ensuring cultural resources are utilised in a sustainable, appropriate and rational manner. Arguably, most if not all the conventions are driven by this imperative, whether it is the imperative preventative obligations of the state parties under the 1954 Hague Convention to the listing of properties in danger under the World Heritage Convention and its equivalent under the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. Thirdly, the intergenerational equity principle of embracing a plethora of initiatives adopted in respect of cultural heritage since decolonisation, including the right to self-determination and cultural development of peoples, through to the right to participate in cultural life, in human rights law, and the broader participatory rights in respect of decision-making and the application of free, prior and informed consent, which we heard about from our Indigenous colleagues earlier today. In addition, it covers the idea and the application of equitable use and benefit sharing. And then finally, the integration of culture into the economic, social and environmental aspects of sustainable development. This integration is reflected in the analogies drawn between cultural diversity and biological diversity. It is aligned with renewed efforts to recognise interrelationship between nature and culture and holistic understandings of cultural heritage. between tangible and intangible, movable and immovable, and initiatives integrating the operation of the culture conventions. The ever-increasing application of sustainable development to international cultural heritage law is pushing all of the culture convention frameworks to address these elements. By extension, it has the potential to consolidate the interpretation and implementation of international cultural heritage law generally and align it more closely with human rights law and international peace and security. Thank you for your time.
For your everything you said was very dense. Very interesting. And we're now switching to some particular issues dealing with sustainable heritage, so sustainability and cultural heritage. And two of our speakers will be addressing the question of cultural heritage and criminal law. We have a more general discourse first from Pascal Beauvais, who will be addressing the question from the point of view of judicial cooperation and trying to make the bridge between, say, reality and the objectives maybe of sustainable development. And then we'll have Sophie Vigneron from a different perspective. So Pascal.
Thank you, dear Clementine. I would like to thank our colleagues who organized this wonderful international colloquium, in particular Professor Anna-Philippa Włodarczyk, who invited us at this very beautiful and prestigious University of Sydney. Secondly, I would like to apologize for my English. The jet lag, unfortunately, did not improve it, but I will try to do my best. As Anna brilliantly demonstrated, for several years, the UN is defending the idea that the principle that there is a strong link between sustainable development and the protection of cultural heritage. For example, the resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 2017 and 2021 on cultural and sustainable development insist on the links between cultural diversity and sustainable development. In this text on sustainable development, the General Assembly invited the member states to defend all the initiatives allowing to better fight against trafficking in cultural property. The resolution underlines the links between sustainable development, cultural diversity, restitution of the cultural heritage to those who have been robbed, and the fight against trafficking. The fight against trafficking in cultural goods is now a part of a new paradigm, of a new international framework, the sustainable development. For criminal law, this new frame is just words, or this new discourse will change the foundations and the modalities of the fight against trafficking in cultural property. That's the question. This integration in the goals of the sustainable development, from my point of view, will change the perspective of the fight against trafficking in cultural property by placing it in a long term and in a central perspective. It is interesting to note that the protection of cultural heritage is very often treated as a present or a short-term issue. It is often presented as an emergency. A short-term issue in crisis and conflicts, emergency measures must be taken for protection, surveillance, investigation, and repression of trafficking in cultural property. It is also presented as a medium-term issue. Trafficking in cultural property is often treated by the authorities as a form of organized crime. This fight requires time to collect evidence, to search for perpetrators, and to prosecute them. Now, in the framework of sustainable development, the criminal fight against trafficking in criminal goods is considered as a part of a long-term policy, a part of a new state organization, a part of a new international organization for the whole humanity. What will be the concrete consequences for criminal law? It's difficult to answer, but my hypothesis is that the criminal fight against trafficking in cultural property will change, will have a new dimension. For decades, the fight against illicit trafficking in cultural property has been progressively included in the traditional mechanism of criminal judicial cooperation. And the criminal law, national and international criminal law, has taken an increasingly important place as a means of deterrence, punishment, and restitution in this field. The fight against property crime has now autonomous rules which deal with the specificities of this kind of crimes: identification, seizure, restitutions. The criminal law techniques of investigation, identification, seizure are very well adapted to the fight against trafficking in cultural property. The international criminal cooperation, based on the state obligation to cooperate in a reasonable delay, is also adapted to this fight at the international level. So criminal law and criminal cooperation have been successful in major emblematic cases in the United States and today in France. However, despite the significant and growing numbers of European and international texts concerning the fight against the trafficking of cultural property, this fight does not seem to be optimal, is not always effective. The integration of the fight against trafficking in cultural property into the long-term objectives of sustainable development of the UN could give new political force and a new dimension to this fight. Classically, international criminal cooperation is based on a relationship between two states. A requesting states ask to a requested states to take measures of investigation, seizure, and coercion. This judicial cooperation implies on both sides a judicial and police system of high quality, because the rules for applying the norm of cooperation are very complex. If one of the two states parties to the cooperation is deficient, it is an obstacle for this cooperation. However, the destruction and trafficking of cultural property are very often committed in weak states, competent by virtue of the principle of territoriality, but unable to investigate, prosecute, and judge these offenses. In recent years, in Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, this country have had great difficulties in implementing an effective policy for the protection of cultural property and, a fortiori, for implementing international criminal cooperation. These difficulties are reinforced when diplomatic relations are suspended. A legal solution is to confer criminal jurisdiction on other states capable of doing so, in particular, the states of destination of the traffic. International and European conventions give criminal jurisdiction now to the states of destination of the traffic. International law obliged states to incriminate in an autonomous way the acts committed in the territories of commercialization of cultural goods. So importation, acquisition, placing on the market, falsification are offenses which give jurisdiction to these states. But it's not sufficient, and perhaps the integration of the fight against trafficking in cultural property into the UN long-term objectives of sustainable development could be an intellectual basis now for a discussion to defend the idea of a universal competence for this category of offenses or crimes. On the other hand, the evolution of international law in the fight against attacks on cultural property is characterized for decades by an increasing precision of the obligation of criminal cooperation. Originally, the obligation to cooperate was general and not very imperative. But now, as Francesco Francioni wrote, as people become aware of the ethical, political, and legal unacceptability of a market without rules for cultural property, the spirit of cooperation advances and becomes more and more precise and obligatory. This movement of precision and extension of the field of judicial cooperation will have, I think, a stronger legal basis in the new frame of UN long-term objective of sustainable development. But this is not sufficient. To be successful, the international fight against trafficking in cultural goods requires an integrated and partnership-based cooperation that goes beyond the traditional judicial cooperation. In this framework of this objective on sustainable development, what could be the future transnational criminal policies and what could be the future transnational criminal tools? In this framework, with these long-term objectives, I think the fight against trafficking in cultural property must take a more central place in criminal policies. But how can we ensure that the criminal policy is becoming a national priority? How can we ensure that this criminal policy is a priority of international judicial cooperation? This is a fundamental question. Firstly, I think this field of the fight against trafficking in cultural property must not be just a field among many others for the criminal judges and prosecutors. We need specialized teams of prosecutors, judges, and investigators who have been specifically trained on the specificity of this criminality and the specificity of the protection of cultural goods. Secondly, these specialized teams, judges, prosecutors, investigators on cultural goods criminality must not be isolated. They must work in networks with cultural heritage professional institutions, with both public and private institutions. These criminal judges, prosecutors, investigators must develop partnership with museum, cultural institution, international institution, academics. This idea of a new form of judicial cooperation based on the constitution of networks and partnerships has been yet promoted at the international level. For example, the UN Security Council resolution of 2016 urged states in the context of the Iraqi and Syrian crisis to engage in a broad international police and judicial cooperation in all its form and aspects. This resolution calls for a cooperation between judges, police, national judges, national policemen, but also with UNESCO, Interpol, and also cultural institutions. According to the explanatory report of the European Nicosia Convention of 2017, we must add to the classic interstate cooperation a new form of cooperation with public and private structure at the international level. It can thus take the form of the establishment of refuge in which endangered cultural property can be kept safe for the duration of a conflict, for example. During the tragic conflicts in Iraq and Syria, a new network of specialized cooperation associating states, international organizations, and private sector has been constituted to ensure a minimum of effectiveness of the international criminalization of acts of destruction and trafficking of cultural property. So I think in the frame of the goals of sustainable development, we must create a global and transnational ecosystem fighting against this criminality, which destroys cultural diversity. In this frame, we have also to think about new offenses, not only the classical offenses we know, theft, illicit takings, trafficking, illicit importation. We have to define what are the offenses against cultural diversity. We also have to think about the way to develop compliance rules in order to protect cultural goods in all the organizations concerned and for the professional concerned, and the way to develop the links between the respect of these compliance rules and the development of new offenses. There are many examples, and this is, we have to imagine with this integration of this field of fighting against trafficking in cultural property. We have to imagine a new solution, but this is a legal basis, a new frame which permits to think the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Despite being jet lagged, it was very clear and interesting. So we'll now come to another way of addressing the issue, I think, with Sophie Vigneron, which is not criminal lawyer, and will be maybe making a more specific link between the specific SDGs and the fight against trafficking.
Thank you, Clémentine. I think my presentation is going to echo what Pascal has said, obviously, because we can find that.
Oh, that's good.
That's,
oh, good.
So as you can see my note, starting by thanks Professor Wojciak, my colleagues from the 4 universities that network, Professor Wong and Professor Boys, for co-organizing this conference on heritage and sustainable development. I also want to thank Auntie Glenda Stubbs, who spoke this morning, for a welcome in our country and also for her very moving words. So the trafficking in cultural property, as you can say, is not a recent phenomenon, and that was mentioned by my colleague Pascal earlier. But one of the problems of this illicit trafficking is that it is very difficult to measure because by definition it is illicit. So what we see sometimes is that cultural property is identified during police and customs operations, so during those different cooperation that exists and that has been developed. So here, for example, this is a picture of Operation Athena, which took place in 2020, which was a coordinated action between 103 countries that resulted in 101 arrests and the recovery of 19,000 artifacts stolen from museums and illicitly excavated or looted from areas in conflict, zones in conflict. So we have, not working slide. No. Okay. So here is a quick outline of my presentation. I'm just going to present shortly the anatomy of a trafficking network so that everyone understands what we're talking about, the trafficking and the sustainable development goals, how those sustainable developments can contribute in addressing or supporting the measures to the adoption of measures to fight the trafficking, because the sustainable development involved measuring progress by the UN. Why this still happens, because what are the challenges of the 1970 convention that aims to address the trafficking of cultural property? As I just said, trafficking is not a recent phenomena. And then the emphasis as well of Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace and security and the UN Security Council resolutions that were mentioned, and a quick conclusion. And we are here as well, just a little picture of artifacts that were stolen from Tunisia. So 114 Tunisian cultural artifacts, cultural objects that had been stolen and illegally exported. But luckily, they had been inventoried by the National Library in 2019 in Tunisia, and therefore they were able to be seized because they had been imported in violation of French law. And so they were negotiated and they should have been returned now to Tunisia. So what is a trafficking network? What are we talking about? And I base here the analysis by colleagues that have written, so Professor Mackenzie and Professor Davis, who have written this article, Temple Looting in Cambodia, Anatomy of a Statue Trafficking Network. And I suppose what I just want to highlight here is that they found that there are only 4 stages or 4 steps in the trafficking network, from a looter, regional dealer, international dealer, and art market. So not many steps, but yet what we find is that the other also highlight this link that was mentioned between organized crime and trafficking of cultural property. So how can I address this network? How can we disrupt these networks from the state country of origin to the country of destination? And what has happened so far? Here we have another picture of items that were looted in Ukraine in 2020, so that was before the current situation of conflict, and so they were looted before then. So what it will show that is the current conflict in Ukraine is going, unfortunately, to increase the rate of looting rather than help stop it. So what are the different sustainable development goals? We see here I've identified quite a few that relate to the trafficking of cultural objects and how the trafficking can impact those different sustainable goals. So it's about fighting poverty, but it's also about good health and well-being. For example, those cultural objects can help social cohesion and participation in communal activities. They also have an impact in SDG 4, education, which is about developing historical identities and respect for diversity and use and access of cultural objects, which was also discussed this morning by the speakers representing First Nations in Australia. So we see how important this is. Sustainable Development Goal 8, but economic growth, which those objects can support tourism and job creation. Reducing inequalities about Sustainable Development Goal 10, because those objects, when they're in the country of origin, can support economic development, cultural diversity, and access to cultural assets. That is extremely important. We have SDG 13 about climate action, because looting and trafficking have an impact on the soil, on the countryside, of the country. That might include destruction of forests, illicit digging, the destruction of natural sites, of trees, of wildlife to access archaeological sites. That also has link. This also happens in life under water, life below water, which is SDG 14. Destruction to access underwater heritage sites. It has happened, for example, in the UK, where shipwreck was blown out so that the swimmers, divers, thank you, so that the divers could access the wreck, inside the wreck, and steal what was in the wreck. So obviously by blowing up the wreck, they also killed the fish around. Life on land, so destruction of forest, wildlife, etc. So, and yet we find that the protection of heritage is only mentioned in SDG 11 in practice in target 11.4, which is about strengthening the effort to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So we see here like there's a little bit of a missing point by the drafters of the SDG. And as was mentioned though, the link between culture and sustainable development has been made since 2015. The specific link between sustainable development and the trafficking of cultural property specifically trafficking of cultural property is found in the different reports since 2017. So, and that's exactly in the word you see highlighted in bold, damaging community, rehabilitation, social cohesion, etc. So I think we're running short of time, so I don't want to spend too much time. But why is this important? This is important because each sustainable development goal has an indicator, a quantitative targets that can be measured. So what we see here is that there is actually an incentive for states to act. There is an incentive for also private stakeholders to contribute to meeting the goals that have been defined. And this is a very positive thing. A colleague of mine, Professor Sophia Labadie in particular, has mentioned this, and she will speak later today about those particular indicators. If we focus exclusively on the indicators for cultural property and specifically the text mentioned by or produced by UNESCO Culture 2030 indicators, that gives us quantitative and qualitative indicators for the fight against trafficking of cultural property. So that includes a checklist, for example, the existence of registry or list or the existence of inventories. Also about the number of heritage items included in the list. So I'm not sure why it is relevant, but it's nevertheless, it is about measurements, so about quantitative measurements, as well as qualitative measurements. And as was mentioned earlier about the creation of specialized units in the police and customs, also about having specific legislation policies, so about the qualitative aspect of those measures. So this is extremely important because that shows, that those are the benchmark that states should meet in order to better protect their cultural heritage against trafficking of cultural property. And that also echoes, I suppose, what I want to say is the checklist that is mentioned here in this Culture 2030 indicators very often indirectly refer to the obligations and duties that are found in the 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. Why does this matter? It matters because as of today, this convention has been ratified by 143 states, including the main market states, which are the USA in 1983, China in 1989, France in 1997, the UK in 2002, Switzerland in 2003, and Germany in 2007. And this convention is based on 3 pillars: prevention, restitution, international cooperation. So prevention first, we see here, there's actually an image from a UNESCO website of a video entitled "The Trail of Stolen Cultural Objects, Stop Trafficking and Save Culture." So the first pillar of the convention is prevention, according to which state parties agree to consider that an import, export, or transfer of ownership of cultural property effected contrary to the provisions adopted under this convention by the states parties should be illicit. This statement of principle is fundamental to the convention as it recognizes that states parties have the right and the obligation to control the export and import of cultural property, and that such control is valid. And that also echoes what was said earlier about criminal cooperation, recognizing that a criminal act in one country will also become a criminal act in another country. So this is extremely important, and that should be measured. So that's how it can be measured. And this obligation exists in a convention to which most state actually in the world have already agreed to do. Restitution is the second pillar. And we have here an image that shows the Heracles sarcophagus, which depicts the 12 works of Hercules. It was identified in 2011 by Geneva customs authorities. And owing to the joint efforts of the Turkish and Swiss authorities, it was returned to Turkey in 2017. So this second pillar is restitution, of which the main provision is found in Article 7 of the Convention. It gives guidance to the implementation of Article 3, but also restricts its application to cultural property that was stolen and documented. Well, so it has very, very shortcomings, but nevertheless, it recognizes that the main principle of the convention is that it should facilitate restitution. And the third pillar is international cooperation. And you have here an image of entitled "After being smuggled out of the kingdom in Cambodia during the civil war and kept in the Cambodian embassy in France for more than 2 decades. The heads of a Brahma statue finally arrived back in Cambodia in March 2016, so it was returned. So the third pillar is cooperation, and that is really fundamental. It runs through the whole convention and includes cooperation to return cultural property removed before the entry into force of the convention, Article 15, technical assistance of UNESCO, in particular regarding information sharing, education, expert advice, and coordination in Article 17, and that is also fundamental. So one of the questions I just want quickly also to mention, because we're running out of time, is institutional challenges. Why has the convention been inefficient? Why hasn't it stopped the trafficking in cultural property since 1970? Well, one of the problems of this convention was first that it had institutional challenges in the sense that states parties did not meet regularly. They only meet regularly since 2012. And the convention also didn't have a subsidiary committee of rule, whose role is actually to control or to oversee, thank you, the implementation of the, thank you, the implementation of the convention. I've been speaking French with my colleagues for too long. Sorry. So this is to monitor the implementation of the convention. So this is really important, and that has only happened since 2012, really in stark contrast to the implementation of the 1972 convention. Also, implementation challenges. The convention didn't really have operational guidelines before 2015, so it didn't really go into detail as to how the convention should be applied. And even though these implementation guidelines do not really mention sustainable development, when they were adopted the same year as 2015, the same year as the Sustainable Development Goals. So we see here that more can be done by the operational guideline. They're actually being revised at the moment. So let's hope that there will be more references to the different sustainable development goals and how the 1970 convention can contribute to achieving those sustainable development goals. Another implementational challenge is the national implementation of the convention itself, where many countries have actually ratified the convention, but have not adopted the necessary legislative requirement for this convention to become binding, because it is a state-to-state. It is an international public law agreement, so it does not bind citizens and it does not create binding obligation on the states if they do not implement, translate this convention into their national laws. And some states have not done that. So what can be done is obviously encouraging states, which UNESCO does, which now the subsidiary committee does as well, is lobbying states so that they better implement the convention. And what we can find, so briefly, I'm really running out of time. Yes, I'm running out of time. But I'm going to go very quickly because actually Pascal has really mentioned, is the reference to SDG 16 in particular, peace and security, justice and security, because we find that in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also find that now, I'm trying to move forward, to the different UN Security Council's resolutions, which were mentioned by Pascal earlier, and how they can contribute to the fight against the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm not going to repeat what has been said, but you can put the two together because they actually complement each other. So finally, let me working. Voilà. Resolution 2347 in particular is really important in that context because it encourages a state party to work together in order to better fight the trafficking against cultural property. So here we are, another picture of a CIS. And to conclude, really, what we have to look at is not, it's not about also the international conventions that exist, including the UN Security Council resolutions. So look at those international instruments, look at how they are implemented at the domestic level, the national level, but also include soft law instruments, in particular stakeholders, in particular dealers, in particular collectors, and change the socio-economic context as well, the socio-economic context of countries of origin who participate in looting, but also the socio-economic context of collectors and art dealers, because they contribute, it's about the supply and demand chain, they contribute to the trafficking of cultural property. So when looking at sustainable development, when looking at achieving these goals and at improving the trafficking of cultural property, we have to look at the whole picture and we have to cooperate better so that we can address the different avenues that will help fighting the trafficking of cultural property and will help also changing mentalities about looting and changing mentalities about collecting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this very complimentary paper, respect from the other one. I now have to introduce a Chinese colleague from Renmin University, from more precisely the School of History. This is Professor Chaiko Queen Wong. Hello. This participation, I think, is really a proof of the richness of this network, because we have here a different perspective and also a different perspective regarding the scholarship and the specialized fields of knowledge. Because Professor Wong is not a lawyer, is specialized in archaeology and comes from is actually teaching archaeology, mostly in Renmin University and its School of History. So he will be addressing a question which has already been raised roughly, that of excavation, which can relate to trafficking, but also to the question of mining and other sustainability issues. So we'll be listening to you, Professor Wong, with great pleasure on China's archaeological excavation and cultural heritage protection in the context of sustainable development. You only have you have 10 minutes. I can't tell it to you later on with a small paper. I have to say it at the beginning. Sorry. So the floor is yours.
好，非常感谢主持
We
人
can't hear you, unfortunately. I think.
介绍。
Okay.
首先非常荣幸，那么参加这样一个私校的这么一个关于考古发掘以及文化遗产保护方面的这样一个高端的这样一个会议。然后也特别感谢人民大学法学院的王云霞教授那么给这样一个机会那么我今天给大家谈的呢是在可持续发展背景下的中国考古发掘和文化遗产保护那么因为我们身在北京所以以北京的这样一个考古发掘作为一个例子，让我们来看一下，那么中国近年的关于考古发掘和文化遗产保护之间的他们这样的一些故事。我们知道呢，北京是一个是中国的首都是一个有着2000万，那么超过2000万人口的这样一个超级的这样一个大城市那么它也有着这个上万年的那么人类发展的这么一个历程。那么有3000多年的这样的建成的历史和这个建都的这样的历史所以也是中国的一个政治、经济、文化的这么一个中心我们知道呢，北京是世界上现在目前世界文化遗产地最多的这样一个城市现在有7项世界文化遗产那么我们明年呢，也就是紧接着在1个月之后的那么 2023年啊，我们这个北京的中轴线啊将申遗，那有可能变为这个北京的第8项的这样的一个世界文化遗产。那么这样一个这个文化遗产地，那么它的这个考古发掘它的工作总量哈，那么占到了我们中国整个的应当说超过10%哈，这样一个规模啊，所以我们说呢，关于北京的这样一个情况呢，也可以是一个就目前哈中国考古发掘的这样一个缩影。那我们大概今天讲4个问题哈，4个方面的问题，一个是北京地区考古发展的这样一个历程，那么第2个是北京地区考古的这样一个特点，还有它的成果，以及在可持续发展视野下的几点思考。那么第一个，我们来看北京地区考古发展的这样的历程。那么根据中华人民共和国文物保护法的这样的规定呢，那么在我们的这个配合基本建设的这个过程中呢，如果发现文物的话呢，那么就要由这个文物部门呢进行组织来考古工作啊。那么因此呢，北京地区的考古这个工作呢，主要也是配合我们这个基本的设施建设和农田水利建设开展啊，因此工作量很大啊。所以大体上呢，从我们中华人民共和国建国开始，那么大概有这么3个发展阶段。那么从1950年到1991年，大概可以算作是第一个文化这个第一个阶段啊。那么在这个阶段呢，我们知道的1950年开始哈，那么中国开始了我们的第一个5年计划5年计划啊。那么这个当时呢，我们还处在这种计划经济体制下啊，所以我们的这个考古工作基本上是围绕着北京的重要的基本的建设工程展开的。由于缺少这个前期的考古的调查和发掘，所以建设单位呢往往在这个就是建设的过程中，那么发现地下的一些考古的一些遗迹遗物所以呢一般来讲呢会马上停工，然后来告诉这个我们的这个文物考古部门由文物考古部门呢去来开展这样的一些文物的这样的一个工作那么这样的一些因为工程量这个跟现在比这个工程量有限，所以它的进度呢也比较慢所以建设的规模一般不大所以呢，那么在这个整个的这个就是配合的这个工作呢做的还是比较好的，所以我们在这个期间发现的一些考古的一些文物包括一些重要的一些墓葬，那么得到了比较好的这样的保护比方说右边的这个大宝台这个西汉墓那么就是一个著名的当时在这个阶段发现的这样一个考古的这样一个墓葬。那么从1992年到2013年那么这段时间呢可以算作是第2个阶段那么在这个阶段呢，应当说出现了不少问题那么从1992年开始呢，中国开始启动了这个住房改革住房改革的全面启动呢，那么这个催生了应当说大量的房地产商的这样的这个开始就是大批的大规模的那么强度也比较大的那么这样的一种发展的模式那么我们在这个国内来讲叫推平头摊大饼类似这样的这种铺天盖地的这样一种发展所以呢，那么由于巨大的这样的利益的驱动呢，所以施工单位呢不愿停工所以那么他们很多的时候呢隐瞒不报就是所以造成了那么这种地下的这样文物交易的这样的灰色的产业，就是说我们在这个在大量的经济建设的当中所以有大量的文化遗产的保护呢受到了很大的影响和挑战那么因为这个在这个施工的这个过程中呢，发现很多文物所以有的时候呢来不及保护所以这个是一个在发展中我们遇到了很大的这样一个问题那么面对这样的问题呢，那么在这样当然经过了多年的酝酿那么在2014年3月北京市呢开始实施一个叫《北京市地下文物保护管理办法》那么这是 在这个省一级的这样的政府里面出土的这个出台的第一个这种就是这个省级政府规章的这样的形式来形成这样一个考古发掘的这么一个这样一个文件那么应当说这样的一个地方的这种法律措施的这样的出台呢，应当说是一个对于我们的这种文物保护来讲就是考古发掘中的这个文物保护和文化遗产保护来讲，是一个划时代的这样一个事件所以从2014年开始呢那么这个随着这个保护办法的这样的实行那么就改变了以往那么先是经济建设，那么后面才有考古那么现在呢，我们的政策是实行先考古，然后再出让这样一种政策的这样的机制。那么这种机制呢，就使得我们过去呢是被动的跟进式的这样的抢救，那么变成了提前的主动的完成那么这样的一个政策呢，也应当说也是一个很好的这个政策导向因此呢，就是从14年以后那么一直到近年吧那么这个其他的全国的各地陆续都有类似这样的一些政策和措施，那么来实行因此呢，那么也对于我们的中国的这种这个文化遗产保护，应当说形成了一个非常好的这么一个良性的这样一个循环。那么还有一个重要的事件呢，是在2020年的9月28号我们中国的最高领导人我们的习近平主席发表了关于考古学的一个重要性的这样一个讲话。那么这个讲话呢，应当说在我们全国在全国得到了非常有力的这样一个贯彻和执行那么北京乃至中国的这个考古和文化遗产保护事业进到了一个非常重要的全新的或者说一个突飞猛进的这样一个时代就是从2020年的9月28号我们叫928这样的一个讲话因为这个讲话里面呢，它特别强调了考古学和考古发掘以及这个文化遗产保护的这样一个重要的意义。那么对于我们中国人的这种文化自信是具有非常重要的这样的意义和价值所以在全国应当说这个掀起了这样的热潮。那么第二个，我们来介绍一下北京地区考古的这样一个特点。北京呢是一个我们知道的中国是一个连绵不断的这样一个古代文明那么发展起来的这样一个现代性的这样的一个国家那么我们的这个特色呢，就是说跟其他地区的文明来讲呢我们这个中华文明呢一直是延绵不断延绵不断。所以在我们整个的比方说尤其像北京或者是其他的一些大城市里边那么都是这种典型的古今连续性的重叠型的这样的城市考古重叠型的就是说从早到晚，那么它都有着这种连续性的这样的地层。那么这个跟可能世界很多地方呢是有所不同的所以这是北京考古的这样一个非常大的这样一个特点就是我们从早到晚那么都有着很重要的一些考古发现。那么因此在北京来讲呢那么就是说它的这个早期的这个就是我们知道的，那么从宋代大概是从就是从13、14世纪开始那么我们这个北京就逐渐成为了我们的这样的都城就是成为这个我们的政治文化中心那么就是我们在中国的这个古代上呢，我们叫辽金元明清，那么这个5个大的朝代那么这个5个大的朝代呢，应当说在这个建都的这个历史基本就是在北京围绕着北京开展的所以北京地区的那么后段的，尤其是这段时间的这样的历史特别大的特别多特别多。但是呢，在我们的这个最初开始认定的，就是我们有一个叫文物保护单位那么这样一个机制，就是重要的一些文化遗址点，我们会进行这样的国家级的、省级的以及这个县一级的这么3级的这样的文物保护单位 那么这样的文物保护单位呢，我们在这个根据我们的文物保护法呢，一般是原则上是不进行发掘的，不进行发掘的。而北京地区早期的我们这个重要的一些考古发现，相对来讲，相对中国的一些其他地方来讲呢，不是非常多。而晚期的这些考古这些就是已经归到了文物保护单位这样的一些文化点呢，又不太好做。那么这是一个就是早期少，那么晚期难做那么这样一个就是稍微有点矛盾的这样的一个情况。但是在北京来讲呢，就是说大遗址，我们就是说这个中国大遗址呢是一个相对来讲是一个有中国特色的这么一个文化遗产的名词就是说是比较重要的，然后呢面积又比较大，那么影响力又比较大的，那么这样的遗址点，我们把它归到了叫大遗址所以在北京来讲呢，它的大遗址是非常多所以资源非常的丰富比方说大家知道的像圆明园像西周的琉璃河燕都遗址包括像元大都包括像明代的城墙等等，这样可能大家这个即使没来过中国，可能也听说过或者是看到过类似这样的一些情况。但是北京地区的考古的成果呢是非常多的比方说早期的旧石器的一些遗址包括这个距今1万年左右的东富林这个遗址，那么在我们的整个的这个中国的这个考古学里边也是占有很重要的这样的意义的这个考古发现还是挺多的包括近些年这个发掘的包括现在正在发掘的琉璃河这个遗址是这个在西周就是很早期的这个阶段，在我们中华文明的青铜时代的一个重要的一个燕都的这样一个遗址现在也正在发掘，也出土了很多重要的一些考古发现包括现在的就是汉代的一些故城广阳城这个陆县故城等等都有包括后面呢也有很多类似这样的一些这个辽晋元明清里面发现的一些重要的一些遗迹遗物这个都是非常多的。当然还有一些就是经典的这么一些文物保护的这样的一些获奖那么就是比方说像故宫的这样的中轴线和周围的一些建筑修缮的方案，包括像天坛的神乐署的修缮的工程那么这样的一些这个文物保护的这样一些经典案例呢，也是近些年的一些比较突出的这样的例子。那么第4点呢，关于可持续发展视野下的几点思考那么一个是呢，就是基建考古就是说配合我们的这样一个经济建设的这样的考古那么应当说从我们的这种持续性上来看，应当说仍然是今后一段时间的一个重要的考古的内容随着中国经济的这种平稳的快速的这样的发展那么北京呢也是这样的。所以在整个的原则上来讲呢，第一个就是说我们的北京的老城区现在已经是这个逐渐得到了很有效的保护所以这种快速的这种房地产的这样的开发呢，现在说得到了这个遏制这个在北京基本上没有这样的一些情况所以那么我们现在的这样一个原则呢，就是适度控制发掘的面积，那么为将来的考古预留空间因为考古呢也是一个重要的这样一种资源所以它的这个现在的这个从国家文物局从最高的这样的文物审批的这样一个机构来看呢，是有着这样的一些考虑的。那么再有一个呢，就是北京地区的它的这种考古的这种不平衡性的问题所以就是像大兴像平谷那么这2个区呢，在过去呢，那么应当说考古的这个做的不多或者说考古发现不多，但是近些年呢，随着大兴国际机场那么建设，还有一些其他的一些这个经济建设，那么我们对大兴和平谷的这样一些那么也在逐步的展开。那么还有一个呢，就是博物馆之城的这样一个建设就是我们这个中国的这个尤其北京那北京的这个博物馆那么数量和质量上，那么已经是在全国的，在我们中国的这个全国的这样的一个前列那么北京城呢，现在也有望建成 那么最大的这种活体的生态的博物馆啊，那么这样营造出一种古今这种沟通的这样的一种氛围，那么也使我们这个我们的最高的领导人提出来的让文化遗产啊，那么活起来啊，那么我们现在应当说北京还是有着特别大的这么一个发展的一个动力和空间。那么第4个呢，就是也是我们近年的近年的这么一个。
If we can switch to maybe some concluding words because we're actually running out of time. I'm really sorry to have to say that as a chairman of the session.
好的。
Thank you.
好的，谢谢。好，那么就是多学科的这样一个发展，那么和参与呢，那么是我们文化遗产领域的应当说是一个这种趋势啊，和我们现在这样普遍的这样一个就是科技手段的应用，在考古上和文化遗产保护上面，那么都得到了很充分的应用。那么再有一个呢，就是人才储备哈，我们现在呢，应当说北京市的这个考古的这个人才的这个储备呢，应当说这进入到了一个新的一个发展的一个阶段，随着我们国家的重视，那么现在有更多的专业的人才进入到考古这个领域。好，那么这就是我今天的发言的内容。好，非常感谢。
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Wong, for this very precise input on some specific questions regarding the Chinese and the Beijing situations. So I'm very sorry we're running out of time. We have to have lunch now, I think. So maybe an hour also will tell some words, I don't know. No, okay. So thank you. We're coming back here in an hour.
Just a little less than an hour so that we can try and keep to our schedule.
Okay, so at 2.
Yeah.
Local time.
Slightly after 2, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.